Welcome to Bookfulness. This is your deep dive, episode 11. Last time, we got into the evolution of sex and recombination. It's pretty complex stuff there.
Absolutely. And today we're sort of zooming out, looking at the bigger picture, the entire life cycle of an organism.
That's right. Moving beyond just how reproduction works to how the whole life history gets shaped.
Exactly. Our mission, if you like, is to unpack how natural selection sculpts, well, everything, survival, reproduction, lifespan, all to maximize fitness within whatever environment the organism lives in.
And we're drawing heavily on Chapter 11 of Evolution, 4th edition, really digging into this question. If evolution wants maximum fitness, why isn't everything immortal and constantly reproducing?
Yeah, that's the core puzzle. And the answer really boils down to constrained optimization. It's all about trade-offs.
Trade-offs, compromises.
Precisely. Every species, no matter how big or small, has a limited energy budget. It has to make choices, evolutionary choices about growing, reproducing, surviving. And getting that balance right for its specific situation, that's what being fit means.
It's hard not to just start with the sheer variety out there. When you look across different species, the ways they approach life survival, making babies, it's just mind-boggling.
It really is. It shows how incredibly adaptable selection can be. I mean, just think about lifespan.
Oh, yeah. The range is incredible. By the way, we'll be mentioning a few figures today, figure 11.1, 11.2, and so on. You can find all of those visuals in the file linked in the description. Definitely worth a look.
Good point. So, yeah, lifespan. You've got things that seem almost immortal, right?
Like some corals. The clonal ones, their stem cells just keep going, potentially for thousands of years.
Exactly. Or think about bristlecone pines, sitting up on cold mountains, living for millennia. They're playing the long game, prioritizing survival over almost everything else.
And then, the complete opposite end, warp speed life.
Right. Like tiny annual plants. Drabaverna is a good example.
Wow.
Sprouts, flowers, seeds, dies, all in just a few months.
Or rotifers, those little aquatic guys. Weeks, sometimes. That's their whole shot.
The contrast is just immense. Thousands of years versus a few weeks. It really highlights how different the selective pressures must be.
And it's the same story with fecundity, the number of offspring.
Yeah.
Huge differences there, too.
Absolutely. You have the volume strategy, think oysters or bivalves generally, releasing literally millions of eggs and sperm.
Just clouds of potential offspring.
Hoping just one, makes it, banking on sheer probability.
But then on the flip side, you get species pouring everything into just one or maybe a few offspring.
The quality over quantity approach, like a blue whale calf, enormous investment right from the start.
The kiwi example always gets me, though. That egg is, 25% of the mother's body mass?
Yeah, it's an incredible statistic. Imagine, say, a 150-pound person giving birth to a 37-pound baby. Physiologically, that's the scale we're talking about. Massive commitment.
So we see this amazing spread in life history traits when reproduction starts. How much, how often, how long you survive. Which brings us back to that puzzle you mentioned.
Right. If living longer is good and having more offspring is good, why hasn't selection just pushed everything towards being, immortal super breeders?
Like that eternally useful fast-breeding oyster we didn't evolve into.
Exactly. And the reason is constraints. You can't maximize everything. Trying to boost one trait, like reproduction, inevitably costs you somewhere else, maybe in survival, maybe in growth. Evolution optimizes within those limits. Hashtag tag 1.2, the cost of reproduction.
Okay, so let's dig into those limits. The core mechanism seems to be the trade-off. And the big one here is the cost of reproduction.
It sounds simple, but it's fundamental. Energy is finite. Every bit of energy, every nutrient, every second you spend making eggs or caring for young or finding a mate.
Is energy you didn't spend on growing bigger or repairing your own body, fighting off disease, that sort of thing?
Precisely. It's an allocation problem. You can't spend the same dollar twice.
So if that's true, genetically, you'd expect a kind of conflict, right? Like genes that ramp up reproduction might inherently have a negative effect on survival, a negative genetic correlation.
That's the theoretical expectation based on this principle of allocation. But it gets a bit tricky when you look at real-world data sometimes.
Why is that?
Because of differences in resource acquisition, some individuals are just better at getting food or are in richer environments.
Ah, okay. So a really healthy, well-fed animal might have enough energy coming in to reproduce a lot and still maintain itself pretty well.
Exactly. Compared to a starving one, it looks like reproduction and survival go hand in hand. It can create a positive correlation in the data.
Even though the underlying physiological trade-off, the cost is still there, The abundance just hides it.
Precisely. It masks the cost, which is why controlled studies are so important. There was a really neat one on seed beetles, Calicibrichus maculatus.
Okay, yeah. Tell us about the beetles. How did they tease apart acquisition from allocation?
Well, they looked at the genetic relationship between how many eggs females laid and how long those females lived, when the beetles had plenty of good food.
High resource acquisition.
Right. They actually found a positive genetic correlation. The healthier beetles did well on both fronts, laid more eggs, lived longer.
Just like you said, the abundance masked the cost.
But then, crucially, they repeated the experiment with females deprived of food, limited resources.
Okay, taking acquisition differences out of the equation.
And bam, the correlation flipped. It became strongly negative. Genes linked to laying more eggs under stress were strongly linked to shorter lifespans.
Wow. So when resources were tight, the cost became crystal clear. Investing in eggs directly reduced survival.
Exactly. It confirms that fundamental allocation trade-off is real, even if conditions sometimes obscure it.
That's a really elegant way to show it. And there's even more direct evidence, too, isn't there?
Yeah.
Where researchers actually removed the reproductive cost entirely. The Anolis lizard study.
Ah, yes. The Anolis segrae experiment. A classic. Really straightforward, powerful design.
These are small lizards, lay one egg at a time, right? So a noticeable, but maybe not huge reproductive effort per clutch.
Correct. So what the researchers did was they surgically removed the ovaries from some wild female lizards, made it physically impossible for them to allocate energy to making eggs.
And they had a control group.
Yep. A crucial control group got a sham surgery. Same procedure, incision and everything, but the ovaries were left intact. So any difference couldn't be blamed on the stress of the surgery itself.
Okay, so you've got reproducers and non-reproducers living in the same environment, facing the same risks. What happened?
The results were striking. The females without ovaries, the ones not paying the cost of reproduction, showed significantly higher growth rates. They got bigger, faster.
And their survival.
Significantly higher survival rates as well compared to the control group that was still reproducing.
That's pretty definitive then. Even that relatively small reproductive investment, one egg at a time, had a measurable negative impact on growth and staying alive.
It proves the point beautifully. Reproduction isn't free. It costs. Energy diverted to making babies is energy not available for maintenance or growth.
Which, as you said, forces this trade-off. And if survival is so important, it leads right into the next big question. Why don't we just live forever? Why does aging happen?
Exactly. This leads us straight into the evolution of aging, or what biologists call senescence. That's the sort of intrinsic, seemingly unavoidable decline in bodily function, in survival probability, and reproductive ability as an organism gets older.
And it's not just simple wear and tear, is it? It's more like an evolved lack of repair, almost.
That's a good way to put it. To understand why evolution hasn't eliminated senescence, you have to think about how selection actually values different parts of the lifespan. Fitness isn't just about how many offspring, but crucially, when you have them.
Right. This is where age structure comes in. Young individuals count more, in a way.
In an evolutionary sense, yes. The fundamental reason is extrinsic mortality, things that kill you from the outside, predators, diseases, accidents, starvation, bad weather.
Stuff that happens regardless of your internal state of repair.
Exactly. In most natural populations, a large fraction of individuals die from these external causes long before they get old in the sense of internal breakdown.
So if a gene has a beneficial effect late in life, fewer individuals are actually around to benefit from it.
Precisely. Think about a mutation that makes you, say, incredibly resistant to cancer at age 80. If, in the ancestral environment where selection shaped us, very few individuals even lived past 40 due to predators or infections,
Then that anti-cancer gene at age 80 is almost invisible to selection. It doesn't get strongly favored because hardly anyone experiences its benefit.
compared to a mutation that, say, helps you fight off childhood diseases or makes you slightly faster at escaping predators when you're young, that mutation benefits almost everyone who inherits it.
So selection's power fades with age, simply because fewer individuals stick around for the later stages.
That's the core concept. The later in life a gene exerts its effect, whether good or bad, the weaker the force of selection acting on it. Hashtag 2.2, the evolutionary hypotheses for aging.
Okay, so this declining power of selection explains why aging persists. And there are two main hypotheses for how it happens, right? They're not mutually exclusive.
Correct. They likely both contribute. The first one is kind of passive, mutation accumulation.
Okay, what's the idea there?
It's simply that selection is too weak to effectively weed out mutations that have harmful effects only late in life. If a gene causes, say, your joints to degenerate, but only after you've already had most of your offspring.
Then whether you have that bad gene or not doesn't much affect how many copies of your genes you pass on.
Right. So these late-acting deleterious mutations aren't strongly selected against. They can just sort of accumulate in the gene pool through random drift, simply because they're hidden from selection for most of an organism's reproductive life.
Like junk building up in the attic because you rarely go up there. Selection just doesn't see it often enough to clean it out.
That's a decent analogy. Selection optimizes for the expected lifespan under natural conditions, not some theoretical maximum.
Okay, that's the passive accumulation idea.
Yeah.
Was the second hypothesis. This one sounds more active. Antagonistic pleiotropy.
Yes, antagonistic meaning opposing effects, and pleiotropy meaning one gene having multiple effects. The idea here is that a single gene can be beneficial early in life, but harmful later on.
How would that work?
Imagine a gene that, say, promotes rapid growth and early sexual maturation. That could give you a big fitness advantage early on. You reproduce sooner, maybe have more offspring overall before you get eaten.
Okay, sounds good so far.
But what if that same gene, the one promoting rapid early development, also causes, say, increased risk of cellular damage or tissue breakdown later in life? Maybe it leads to earlier cancer or heart disease.
So it helps you live fast early on, but makes you die young later, a direct trade-off controlled by one gene.
Exactly. And the crucial point is, selection can strongly favor this gene if the early benefit, more reproduction sooner, outweighs the later cost, dying earlier. Given that extrinsic mortality means fewer individuals reach old age anyway.
The early benefit is realized much more often than the late cost is paid.
Precisely. So selection actively favors genes that give you an early advantage, even if they carry a ticking time bomb for later life. It's that fundamental trade-off, again, current reproduction versus future survival, baked right into the genome.
It's like building a race car engine optimized for maximum power now, even if it wears out much faster than a standard engine.
That's a great way to think about it. And we have experimental evidence supporting this, particularly from studies on fruit flies, Drosophila.
Right, the selection experiments, what did they find?
Researchers used artificial selection. They bred lines of flies specifically for increased reproduction late in life, and other lines specifically for high reproduction early in life.
Okay, pushing the trade-off to its extremes.
And they found clear evidence of the trade-off. The fly lines selected for high early reproduction consistently evolved shorter average lifespans and had lower reproductive success later in life if they did survive.
So boosting the live fast component directly reduced the live long component. The genetic changes that improved early performance came at the direct cost of later performance and longevity.
It's strong support for antagonistic pleiotropy. The genes maximizing early output inherently compromise the systems needed for long-term maintenance. Aging isn't a mistake. It's a non-adaptive byproduct of selection prioritizing fitness during the reproductively crucial early stages of life.
Okay, we've covered the internal trade-offs like reproduction versus survival leading to aging. Now let's shift focus to the external environment. How do things like how crowded it is, population density, shape these life strategies?
This brings us to a really classic ecological concept: R selection and P selection. These ideas come directly from models of how populations grow over time.
Right, the logistic growth curve. Population size, N, grows, but the rate slows down as it approaches the carrying capacity, K.
Exactly. The instantaneous rate of increase is called R. When the population N is very small, it grows close to its maximum potential rate, R nullers. But as N gets closer to K, the actual rate R drops towards 0.
Because resources get scarce, competition increases, waste builds up, all that density-dependent stuff.
Precisely. So R and K selection describe two opposing selective pressures based on where a population typically finds itself on this curve.
Let's start with K. What does K-selected mean?
K-selected species are those typically living in stable environments where their populations are usually at or near the carrying capacity. K conditions are crowded, resources are limited, and competition is intense.
So being able to reproduce really fast isn't the main advantage here.
Not really. Selection in K environments favors traits that enhance competitive ability and efficiency in using scarce resources. Things like larger body size, slower development, longer lifespan, fewer offspring, but with higher parental investment to ensure they survive the competition.
Quality over quantity, focused on survival in crowded conditions.
Right. These traits often lead to populations that can maintain a high density, a high K, but they might have a relatively low maximum growth rate. They're good competitors, but not necessarily fast colonizers.
Okay, so what about the other end? R-selected species.
Our selected species are the opposite. They often live in unstable or unpredictable environments where their populations are frequently well below the carrying capacity. Maybe there are frequent disturbances or huge fluctuations in resources or massive predation events that keep numbers low.
So competition isn't the main issue here. It's more about bouncing back quickly.
Exactly. In these situations, selection strongly favors traits that maximize the rate of population increase. This means things like rapid development, early maturation, short lifespan, and producing huge numbers of offspring, often with little parental care.
Quantity over quality. Get your genes out there fast before the next crash, or while resources are temporarily abundant.
Precisely. They're often poor competitors if conditions stabilize, but they're excellent colonizers and can explode in numbers rapidly when conditions are good.
The classic example is ecological succession, right? Like after a fire.
Perfect example. A forest fire clears the land, creating an open, resource-rich environment with low density. Who moves in first?
The weeds. Fast-growing, lots of seeds, short lives.
Exactly. The raw selected pioneers, they dominate initially. But over time, slower growing, more competitive species shrubs, then trees start to establish.
The K-selected species. They grow slower, live longer, invest more in structure, and eventually outcompete the weeds for light and resources.
Right. They gradually drive the system towards K again. So R and K represent two ends of a spectrum of life history strategies, shaped primarily by population density and environmental stability.
Within that RK spectrum, a really key trait is when and how often you reproduce. We mostly think of iteroparity reproducing multiple times throughout life, like humans or birds.
That's the common pattern for many K-selected species, investing repeatedly. But there's the alternative, similarity.
The Big Bang strategy.
Yeah.
Reproduce once, often massively, and then die.
Yeah, it seems incredibly risky putting all your reproductive eggs, literally sometimes, into one basket. So why does it evolve?
There must be specific conditions where it pays off more than playing it safe and reproducing repeatedly.
Generally, two conditions often favor similarity. First, if the potential reproductive output increases dramatically with size or age, waiting longer gives you a much, much bigger payoff, making the wait worthwhile.
Okay, like maybe a plant that can make vastly more seeds if it waits an extra year to grow bigger.
Right. And the second condition is if the act of reproduction itself is incredibly costly or dangerous, making survival afterwards highly unlikely anyway.
Ah, the Pacific salmon swimming upstream.
The absolute classic example. That journey is so physiologically brutal, swimming against currents, not feeding, fighting rivals, digging nests, that their chances of surviving to spawn again are virtually zero.
So evolutionarily, it makes sense to just go all out in that one shot because there probably won't be a second chance.
Exactly. Maximize the output of the one likely attempt.
What about that first condition, the exponential payoff with size? You mentioned plants.
Yeah, there are some great plant examples. Century plants, some bamboos. There's also a fascinating tree example from the Amazon, Tachigali baskisi.
Okay, tell me about this tree. How is it semiparous?
Well, it employs a high-risk, high-reward strategy. It grows incredibly fast.
Which sounds more array selective.
It is, in a way. It achieves this rapid growth by producing very low-density wood, lightweight, structurally weaker wood.
Why do that?
Because in the crowded rainforest understory, the race is to get to the sunlight in the canopy. Growing fast, even with weak wood, increases its chances of reaching the light before being fatally shaded out by competitors. It's prioritizing rapid height gain.
So it's maximizing its chance of surviving to reproductive age by growing fast, even if the wood quality suffers.
Exactly. But that low-density wood means it's not built for the long haul structurally. So once it reaches a certain large size, instead of trying to live for centuries like other canopy trees...
It cashes in its chips.
Precisely. It puts all its accumulated resources into one massive flowering and fruiting event, a huge reproductive output. And then it typically dies. Often its weak structure just gives way. The single enormous reproductive bang compensates for the lack of longevity and repeated attempts. Hashtag 3.3 predation and the guppy experiment.
These trade-offs between R and K strategies become really vivid when you can see selection actually pushing populations one way or the other. The Trinidadian guppy studies are famous for this, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. A cornerstone of evolutionary ecology. It's a beautiful natural experiment system.
Because you have guppies living in different streams, or even different parts of the same stream, with very different predators.
Exactly. You've got high predation HP sites, usually downstream, where large cichlid fish are present. These cichlids can eat guppies of pretty much any size.
So mortality is high, and it doesn't really matter how big you get. Life is short and dangerous.
Right. Which should strongly favor reselected traits. Mature fast, reproduce young, make lots of babies before you inevitably get eaten.
Okay, and then you have low predation LP sites.
Often upstream, maybe above waterfalls that the big cichlids can't pass. Here, the main predators might be smaller killifish, which mostly prey on small juvenile guppies.
Ah, so being bigger is actually an advantage here. It helps you survive predation and maybe compete better.
Exactly. In these LP sites, guppy populations are much denser. Competition for food is intense. So selection should favor K-selected traits. Grow larger, mature later, produce fewer but possibly larger offspring that are better equipped to survive early predation and compete for resources.
Makes sense. So did the guppies actually show these differences?
They did. When researchers collected guppies from HP and LP sites and raised them side by side in a common garden environment in the lab, this is key, removing the direct environmental effects.
To see the underlying genetic differences.
Right. They found exactly what the theory predicted. Guppies from the HP populations matured significantly earlier at a smaller size. They produced more offspring per brood, and those offspring are smaller. They also allocated a larger proportion of their energy budget to reproduction. Classic R strategy.
And the LP guppies.
They matured later at a larger size. They had fewer but larger offspring per brood. They invested more in growth and likely competitive ability. Classic case strategy.
Okay. That's strong correlational evidence. But the really cool part was the transplant experiment, wasn't it?
That was the clincher. They took guppies from a high predation site and introduced them into a nearby stream section above a waterfall that previously had no guppies but did have the low predation conditions. Killifish predators, potential for high density.
So they put rise-selected guppies into a case-selecting environment.
Exactly, and then they watched what happened over generations. The results were incredibly fast. Within just a few years, maybe 10, 20 generations, which is quick for evolution, the introduced guppy populations evolved life history traits that were much more similar to the native low predation populations.
They started maturing later, growing larger.
Yes. They shifted significantly towards the K-selected end of the spectrum, purely in response to the change in predation pressure and the resulting increase in population density and competition.
Wow. That's direct experimental proof of rapid adaptive evolution shaping life history in response to ecological conditions. Fantastic example. Hashtag 3.4, the optimal clutch size paradox.
Okay, so the guppies show how predation risk can drive things towards faster, earlier reproduction. But let's go back to the other end, the K-selected species, often with low reproduction. Why do animals like, say, albatrosses or even humans typically have so few offspring at a time? Just one, often. Seems like they could physically produce more.
This brings us to another key concept developed by David Lack, focusing on birds initially. Lack's hypothesis on optimal clutch size.
What was his idea? He argued that the clutch size favored by natural selection isn't the maximum number of eggs a female can lay. Instead, it's the number that results in the maximum number of offspring surviving to fledge or become independent.
Ah, so it's not about egg production capacity, it's about successful rearing capacity.
Precisely. The trade-off is the parent's ability to care for the young. If a bird lays too many eggs,
They might not be able to find enough food to feed all those hungry mouths.
exactly. The chicks might be undernourished, weaker, and fewer might actually survive to leave the nest compared to a slightly smaller, better-fed brood.
So laying more eggs could actually result in fewer successful offspring.
It can. But there's another critical part to the trade-off Lack highlighted, the cost to the parents themselves.
Raising that huge brood wears them out.
Terribly. It drains their energy reserves, making them less likely to survive until the next breeding season, or perhaps unable to breed successfully the following year. So maximizing output this year might severely compromise your total lifetime reproductive success.
The trade-off between current and future reproduction.
Exactly. The optimal clutch size balances the benefit of more offspring now against the cost to parental survival and future breeding attempts.
And this has been tested experimentally too.
Famously, yes. Long-term studies on great tits, Paris Major in Wytham Woods, Oxford, are a classic example. They observed the natural average clutch size was around 9 eggs. Then, they manipulated clutch sizes.
Added eggs to some nests, removed them from others.
Right. If they artificially reduced the clutch size below the average, say to 6 or 7 eggs.
The parents raised those easily, but overall produced fewer fledglings than average nests. Fitness was lower.
Correct. But if they artificially increased the clutch size, say to 11 or 12 eggs,
The parents struggled.
they struggled. Fewer chicks per nest survived to fledge because they were underfed. And crucially, the survival rate of the parent birds over the following winter dropped significantly. The effort of raising the enlarged brood took too much out of them.
So fitness dropped if you went below the average, and it dropped if you went above it. The natural average really was the optimum.
Exactly. It beautifully confirmed Lack's hypothesis. Selection finds the sweet spot that maximizes the number of surviving offspring over the parent's lifetime, considering both chick survival and parental costs. Sometimes less is indeed more. It's worth just briefly mentioning that these life history trade-offs also interact with things like mating strategies. For instance, changing sex during life, sequential hermaphroditism.
Right, like fish where they start as one sex and switch later.
Yeah.
Protogeny, female first, or protandry, male first.
Yeah. That switch is often favored when reproductive success depends heavily on size, but differently for males and females. If large males have a huge mating advantage, like in harem-holding fish.
It pays to be female when small, and switch to male only when you get big enough to compete.
Exactly. It's another life history optimization driven by fitness trade-offs related to age and size.
Okay, interesting link. But let's broaden out again from specific traits to the organism's overall job or address in the ecosystem. Its ecological niche.
Right. The niche encompasses everything. The range of temperatures an organism can tolerate, the habitats it uses, the food it eats, its predators, its diseases, the whole set of interactions.
And just like with our case strategies, we see a spectrum here too, particularly regarding resource use. We talk about niche width.
Exactly. We distinguish between specialists, which have a narrow niche, maybe they eat only one type of plant, or live only in a very specific habitat.
Like that juniper geometer moth you mentioned earlier, only eating juniper.
Perfect example. Contrast that with generalists, which have a broad niche. They can utilize a wide range of resources or tolerate diverse conditions.
Like the fall cankerworm moth eating lots of different trees.
Yeah.
Or say, a raccoon that can eat garbage, berries, insects, and live in forests or cities.
Or the blue crab example is good too, tolerating huge swings in salinity that would kill most specialized marine crabs. That's broad physiological tolerance. Hashtag TagTech 4.2, the master of none trade-off.
So this brings up a similar question to the RK one. Why specialize? Being a generalist seems inherently safer, more flexible. If your one food source disappears, you just switch to another one. Why restrict yourself?
It seems counterintuitive, but the main hypothesis again comes down to a trade-off. It's often summed up by the saying, a jack of all trades is master of none.
Meaning, being good at many things prevents you from being truly excellent at any one thing.
That's the idea. The hypothesis is that maintaining the physiological, morphological, or behavioral machinery needed to perform well across a wide range of conditions or resources inherently compromises your peak performance in any single condition or on any single resource.
The specialist, by contrast, can ditch all the machinery for other tasks and pour all its evolutionary resources into optimizing for its narrow niche, becoming supremely efficient there.
Exactly. And we see evidence for this kind of trade-off across different levels.
Like cognitively.
Yeah. There was that aphid study comparing specialist and generalist populations. The specialists were significantly faster and better at finding their specific host plant and accessing the sap compared to the generalists presented with the same plant. The specialist's search, image, and feeding behavior were just better tuned.
Okay. What about physical, morphological trade-offs?
The flower piercer birds are a great example here. They have this highly specialized hooked bill, perfect for punching holes in the base of flowers to steal nectar.
A very specific tool for a specific job.
Right, and experiments showed that if you artificially clipped that hook, temporarily making their bill more generalized, like their non-hooked relatives.
They became worse at piercing flowers, their specialized task.
Correct. But, and here's the trade-off, those same birds with the clipped bills became better at handling and eating berries, which is what their generalist relatives mostly eat.
Wow. So the very feature that made them masters of nectar theft made them worse at berry eating. Clear morphological compromise.
Absolutely, and maybe the most fundamental level is physiological.
Like the copepods in salinity.
Exactly. The Eurytomora affinis copepods. Remember, different populations were adapted to either high salinity seawater or low salinity freshwater.
And they survive best in their home environment. No surprise there.
Right. But the crucial finding came from looking at the genetics within populations. They found strong negative genetic correlations for survival at different salinities.
Meaning the genes that helped individuals survive well in high salt actively made them survive poorly in low salt, and vice versa.
Precisely. The physiological adaptations for dealing with salt stress were genetically antagonistic to the adaptations needed for dealing with freshwater conditions. You couldn't be genetically optimized for both simultaneously. Specialization was driven by this underlying physiological conflict.
So, being a generalist requires maintaining two conflicting sets of machinery, neither of which can be perfectly optimized.
That's the core idea behind the master of none trade-off. If the performance gain from specializing is big enough, selection will favor ditching the flexibility and becoming highly efficient in one narrow domain.
Okay, so the master of none trade-off makes a lot of sense for why specialization evolves. But then the book throws a curveball. It suggests specialization can evolve even if there isn't a direct performance trade-off. How does that work? If you can perform equally well on two food types, why give one up?
This is a really interesting and perhaps less intuitive mechanism. It comes down to the sheer power of selection acting on the most abundant resource.
So it's not about performance differences, but about probability,
Mhm.
which resource you encounter most often.
Exactly. Think about that herbivorous insect again, maybe a moth, that could potentially eat two types of plants, plant A and plant B. Let's say plant A is super common, covering 90% of the habitat, and plant B is rare, only 10%.
Okay.
Now imagine a random beneficial mutation pops up that makes the moth larva slightly better at digesting or surviving on plant A.
Since plant A is everywhere, that mutation immediately benefits 90% of the moth population that happens to land on it.
Right. So that beneficial mutation will be under very strong positive selection and will spread rapidly through the gene pool.
Okay. Now, what if a different mutation arises that gives a similar small benefit, but on the rare plant B?
That mutation only benefits the 10% of the population that happens to encounter plant B. Selection will still favor it in those individuals, but its overall spread through the entire population will be much, much slower, simply because fewer individuals experience its benefit.
So adaptation to the common resource, A, happens much faster than adaptation to the rare resource, B, just because of exposure frequency.
Precisely. The population's genome becomes optimized for plant A much more quickly, and this leads to a secondary selective pressure.
Which is?
Selection then favors the evolution of a behavioral preference. If the moths are now genetically better adapted to thrive on plant A,
Then females who choose to lay their eggs only on plant A will have offspring with higher average survival and fitness than females who lay eggs randomly or on plant B.
exactly. So a preference for the abundant, better adapted to resource gets favored, even if the moths could still physically survive on the rare resource. The preference reinforces the specialization.
So specialization arises not from a performance trade-off, but because adaptation happens faster on the common resource, making it the best bet evolutionarily, which then drives the evolution of host choice. That's fascinating.
It shows how ecological factors like abundance can drive evolutionary trajectories in powerful ways, sometimes independent of direct physiological constraints. Hashtag 5.2 mutational decay and reinforcement.
That makes sense as an active selection process. But isn't there also a passive way specialization gets locked in over time? Something called mutational decay.
Yes, that's another important factor, especially in reinforcing specialization once it has begun.
How does that work? Is it like use it or lose it genetically?
Pretty much. If a moth population becomes highly specialized on plant A, perhaps due to the abundance mechanism we just discussed, and develops a strong preference for it, they very rarely encounter or utilize plant B anymore.
Okay, so the genes specifically required for surviving on plant B are no longer being actively used or tested by selection.
Exactly. Selection is relaxed on those plant B survival genes. When selection is relaxed, there's no pressure to weed out random deleterious mutations that might crop up in those genes.
Mutations that might disable the ability to digest plant B toxins or recognize it as food.
Right. These harmful mutations can accumulate purely by chance, genetic drift, because they don't hurt the moth as long as it stays on plant A. Over time, enough of these inactivating mutations can become fixed in the population.
So the species literally loses the genetic ability to use plant B, not because using B hurt its performance on A, but just through neglect.
Precisely. It's a passive loss of function for unused traits. This genetic decay makes the specialization irreversible, effectively locking the species into its narrow niche.
Okay, so putting it all together from today, It seems like an organism's entire life strategy, its life history, is shaped by this constant interplay between internal limits and external pressures.
That's a great way to summarize it. We have two major drivers acting simultaneously.
First, those internal, inescapable trade-offs, primarily the allocation of limited energy between keeping yourself going survival, maintenance, growth, and reproducing.
And this fundamental trade-off is really what underlies the evolution of aging, or senescence, through mechanisms like mutation accumulation and antagonistic pleiotropy, driven by the fact that selection's power declines with age.
Right. And then second, you have the ecological constraints imposed by the outside world.
Yeah, factors like how crowded the environment is, how stable it is, what the predation risks are like, and how resources are distributed.
And these ecological factors push species along continuums, like the rise selection versus K-selection spectrum, optimizing for rapid reproduction versus competitive ability.
Or the specialist versus generalist spectrum, optimizing for peak efficiency in a narrow niche versus broader flexibility.
So the incredible diversity of life histories we see out there, the short-lived rotifer, the ancient pine, the salmon's big bang, the albatross's single chick, the specialist moth, the generalist crab, it all reflects natural selection finding the optimal compromise point along these axes for each species in its particular context.
Exactly. There's no single best way to live. Fitness is always relative, always constrained. It's about finding the best possible solution given the rules of the game set by physiology and ecology. Hashtag outro.
That was a really comprehensive look at how organisms are shaped by the fundamental compromises of life. We saw how fitness involves balancing reproduction against survival, how that balance inevitably leads to aging, and how selection just doesn't care as much about what happens late in life.
Yeah, and we explored how the environment, particularly population density and predation, drives strategies ranging from the live fast, die young worry selection to the slow and steady competitive case selection. Plus the fascinating reasons behind specialization. Sometimes it's being a master of one trade, other times it's just adapting best to what's common.
These principles of fitness, trade-offs, and competition have mostly focused on the individual organism trying to maximize its success. But things get even more complex and maybe even more interesting when individuals start interacting with each other.
Oh, absolutely, because then you get into the evolution of social behaviors.
Yeah.
Why cooperate? Why fight? Especially, why fight with your own family? How can something like altruism, helping others at a cost to yourself, even evolve if selection is fundamentally selfish?
Those are huge questions. So, next time, we're diving right into that. The evolution of cooperation and conflict. We'll explore the puzzles of altruism, kinship, and social interactions.
It should be a fascinating discussion, tackling some of the biggest questions in evolutionary biology.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for tuning into Bookfulness. Join us next time.